We can use the knowledge on heart development to explain some of the heart malformations. Now, there is a plethora of heart malformations because the embryogenesis of heart is very complicated and long process. Therefore, many things can go wrong. But let's illustrate, let's give examples of some few typical malformations. Let's start with the atrial septal defect. Now in the frontal section, the scheme will show the sinoatrial opening, the right atrium, the right ventricle, interventricular septum, left ventricle, left atrium. But what if happens that the septum primum is, for example, too short, or the foramen ovale is too large? So even when the septum primum tries to close the foramen ovale, it cannot. So this will be the foramen ovale, the septum secundum, and the septum primum. But there is a wide communication remaining between the left atrium and right atrium. Now, what can go wrong? If this opening persists after birth, the blood flows through the sinoatrial opening into the right atrium, flows into the right ventricle, left ventricle. However, after birth, the blood flows from the left atrium not only into the left ventricle, but through that opening also into the right atrium, and therefore into the right ventricle. Due to the pressure difference between the left and right atrium, this results in overloading the myocardium of the right ventricle, which reacts by thickening the hypertrophy of right ventricle. Hypertrophy means increase in size and thickness. Because the right ventricle is overloaded by too much blood and too much by too much blood coming into it. So this could be caused either by, for example, excessive apoptosis of the septum primum. So the septum primum is too short. Alternatively, there could be too small septum secundum, leaving the foramen ovale too large. So after birth, we can see a left to right shunt on the level of atria. That's a pathological shunt, resulting in overloading the right ventricle myocardium, which has other consequences, because hypertrophy of right ventricle, which is a response on that overloading, furthermore it will increase the blood pressure in pulmonary arteries, resulting in pulmonary hypertension. You will hear about that in other subjects. This atrial septal defect should not be confused with a condition called foramen ovale patens. Normally, when the foramen ovale is closed by the septum primum, the septum secundum and the septum primum should fuse together. The pieces of tissues should fuse together. If this doesn't happen, and the septum primum only works as a one-directional valve, there is a potential communication between the right atrium and left atrium, which under normal circumstances is closed due to the pressure difference. But should that pressure difference be reversed sometimes in the future, it could reopen again. So that means septum primum is closing the foramen ovale, but not fusing with the septum secundum. Let us discuss another heart malformation called the tetralogy of Fallot. Tetralogy, so you can hear there will be a combination of 4 defects. Tetralogy of Fallot. F-A-L-L-O-T. The primary defect here, and there are 4 defects, but the primary problem here is interventricular septal defect. So if this is the heart with the right ventricle, interventricular septum, left ventricle, the first problem here, number 1, is the interventricular septal defect. Second problem is that the aorta, which is normally supposed to take blood from the left ventricle only, is overriding over that defect. So that's the problem number 2. Thus receiving blood not only from the left ventricle but also from the right ventricle. It's called overriding of aorta. The third problem is that there is quite often there is a stenosis, a narrowing of the pulmonary trunk. Here, which is called pulmonary artery hypertrophy. So it's smaller than it's supposed to be. Or stenosis. Stenosis means the tube is more narrow than it's supposed to be. And similar to the previous case, there is a response of the myocardium of the right ventricle, because it's forced to work against the resistance of not only the pulmonary artery, but also against the resistance of the aorta. That's not normal, right? So it's overloaded and it reacts with hypertrophy. So we can see how one defect caused several others, making a combined heart malformation. Another point here would be malformation of in some of the large arteries. Normally, I mean now the ductus arteriosus problems. Normally, before birth, how does the situation look like? If this is the aortic arch, and this is the pulmonary trunk with the right pulmonary artery. Now the ductus arteriosus. Normally before birth, well, this is the arcus. The aortic arch. This will be the pulmonary trunk. The right, the left pulmonary artery, the right pulmonary artery, and this is the ductus arteriosus. Technically it should be like more in this position, but never mind. Topologically it will still make sense. Now normally before birth, the blood from the left ventricle flows into the aorta through the aortic arch to the body and all the branches. But the blood from the right ventricle flows into the pulmonary trunk, but can all the blood go to the lungs? It cannot. Why? Because the lungs are compressed with extremely high vascular resistance that does not permit the blood to flow in. Blood is incompressible fluid. Therefore, a significant volume of blood will escape through that ductus arteriosus into the aortic arch. So normally it works as a right to left physiological shunt. Why right to left? Because it's the blood from the right ventricle that comes to the systemic circulation supplied by the left ventricle. So even it's an extra cardiac shunt. You can call it right to left shunt. Now this stops after birth, right? After birth, what happens? After birth, when the lungs start to breathe, this results in higher or in increase in the partial pressure of the oxygen. And while some molecules called prostaglandins are keeping the ductus arteriosus open, there will be a closure or spasm of the smooth muscle of the ductus arteriosus. So there's a vascular spasm, and later on the ductus arteriosus is closed and later on obliterated. So after a few months there is only a ligament called ligamentum arteriosum where the ductus used to be. But what if the ductus arteriosus remains open? In Latin, open means patens. It's persisting after birth. What is the problem with that? Now here's the left ventricle, right ventricle. But after birth, the blood pressure is significantly greater in the systemic circulation. So the blood pressure is higher in the aorta than in the pulmonary arteries. So the blood flow is reversed here, and through the open ductus arteriosus some blood comes extra to the pulmonary arteries. So there is a left to right shunt, and this is already pathological. Again, there is a problem with the pressure overloading of the pulmonary circulation with the pressure and the blood propagating from the aorta through the opened ductus arteriosus. So we don't want that. Another and last of these examples of heart malformations would be the coarctation of aorta. There are basically two types depending on the mutual position of the coarctation means like a narrowing, okay, narrow part. If it is before the ductus arteriosus, it's called pre-ductal. If it's after, it's called post-ductal. The aortic arch. Now the pulmonary trunk. With the pulmonary arteries, and there will be here the narrowing of the aorta. So this is a pre-ductal coarctation. It's the most common form when it comes to this malformation, and this is a post-ductal coarctation. It's a rare form So there are really much more defects. This was just to explain a few of them. I am sure you will hear about many heart defects in pathology classes, in internal medicine, and more specifically in cardiology.